Good morning. You're like my students, you don't answer. Your Excellencies, fellow Carleton faculty and students, honorable guests, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the first panel of this conference on the African Union 2063. Panel 1 will be getting into details about some of the issues that have been raised in the introductory session. During the introductory session, a lot was mentioned about dressing Benin, in-laws in Lesotho, and Ghana. I'm not from Ghana, but I brought a Ghanaian tie celebrating 50 years of independence. So I think I'm legit. My name is Kiggundu. I'm a professor at Carleton University in the Sprott School of Business. Somebody mentioned about the private sector. Yes, we're here. I'm also cross-appointed with Institute of African Studies. And I'm glad to say that I was one of those who really pushed for a conference on this theme of the Agenda 2063, when there were a lot of skeptics about what the heck they are talking about. After all, they have talked about other things that they didn't put in progress. Attendance today shows that we are right bang on. This is an issue that needs to be discussed further. I do believe that human progress is informed by the past and shaped by the future. In fact, at the turn of the century, we begin to see a lot of organizations focusing on what the future is going to look like, whether we are talking about the UN Millennium Development Goals, whether we are talking about PricewaterhouseCoopers talking about the world in 2050, whether we are talking about the World Bank. And I think you can look at this AU 2063 in the context of people and nations trying to say, hey, what is the world going to look like, especially given forces of globalization, some of which have been referred to in introductory sessions. When you look at the website for Agenda 2063, and Blair tells me that eventually he's going to give you a password to be able to do that, but not yet. There are three things you find on the website immediately in FS. One is unity, the other one is prosperity, the third one is peace. And then there's a statement which says, a global strategy to optimize use of African resources for the benefit of all Africans. And they talk about the future we want for Africa. So I think while the past is interesting, and we cannot forget about it, we also want to really focus on the future and talk about what kind of future we actually want, rather than what kind of past we have actually lost. This session is about sustainable development, governance, and leadership. I want to remind you of three things my president said: collaboration, leadership, and resilience. And I think as we begin to talk about sustainable development, as we begin to talk about governance and leadership, I think we have to remember these things. Of course, other speakers, like the High Commissioner of Ghana, have made reference to some of these things and provided an academic, critical sort of analysis of the things past. In this session, we have got three speakers. Professor Samy, Madam Louise and Dr. Patricia Malikail. They will be going in that order. And I will not be really spending a lot of time introducing them. Their bios are available to you. All I have, and I'll say briefly for each of them as they begin to take the podium. I'll start with Professor Samy, who is professor of here at Carleton, Norman Patterson School of International Affairs. He does a lot of work in international development. He's an African like you and I, and he is going to talk about, I don't know what you're going to talk about. Yes, at least you're listening. He is going to be talking about domestic resource mobilization. The High Commissioner of Ghana talked about resources, but he was talking about the resources we have in the ground. There is a very serious issue about domestic resource mobilization and utilization. I'll give you two examples. One is, if you are paying attention to the recent summit, AU summit in Addis, there was a statement that came through which said that the AU budget is funded more than 90% by external sources. So as we talk about all these aspirations and inspirations and how to implement them, we have to be mindful about the need to mobilize resources to finance the programs that arise out of the themes that the agenda is talking about. I do work with an organization called the Africa Capacity Building Foundation. And our interest in this agenda is to ask the question of, do we have the capacities on the ground needed to implement this agenda? And so the issue of domestic resource mobilization is of critical importance for us. Without going into your speech, I will call upon you to make a presentation. Dr. Samy. Thank you. Now you can take it. Do you want here or the other?
You should have a clicker in here.
Thank you, Moses. Thanks, Blair, for inviting me. I just want to give you a bit of context in terms of what I'm going to do and why I ended up being here. Blair approached me a few months ago and asked me if I wanted to present at this conference, and I, of course, as usual, I said yes. And of course, I realized afterwards that I had a lot of work to do. I was at the time working on a paper on taxation in Africa, so that's essentially what I'm going to talk about. It's domestic resource mobilization, but I think there's different ways to mobilize resources. I'm going to focus mostly on taxation, so it's very exciting, taxation. And I think it's a really important subject because that's ultimately how you build a pact between states and people. And I think, if you want to have if you want to have states that are responsive to citizens' needs, you have to tax them and then provide them something in return. And I think in too many places this link does not exist, and I think this is a really, really important issue in the African context. Moses mentioned that I am African, so yes, I am, but I'm from Mauritius, which is a small island off the east coast of Madagascar, for those of you who don't know. And Mauritius actually is celebrating its independence today. So we're from, 47 years. So, and it's a country, as many of you, that has been extremely, extremely successful in the African context. So why is this important? I took a quote from the popular version of Agenda 2063. It's a very long quote, but I've highlighted a few things in there because I think they really connect with what I want to talk about. In the document, there's mention of Africa financing its own development, which I think is really important. So taxation definitely has a role to play. I suppose the vision 50 years from now will be that Africa no longer needs to rely on foreign aid, which would be fantastic if that were to happen. Having capable, inclusive, and accountable states and institutions, so that's the fiscal pact between states and citizens, and I think, again, this is very relevant to what I'm going to talk about. And then if you go further in the document, you will see that there's actually explicit language about strengthening domestic resource mobilization, and then build effective, transparent, and harmonized tax and revenue collection systems and public expenditure. And I've put this as my emphasis because that's really what I want to talk about. Of course, the document contains a lot more than what I'm going to discuss, but I think it's a good starting point. And there are many connections that I will make with what previous speakers earlier today have talked about. I think Dr. Suli Gariba raised an important question, and then this is really one of the things that I have been talking a lot about in the last few years, and there are some students in this room who can confirm this because they've been in my lectures, and one of the interesting things, and perhaps in a way a tragic story as well that comes out of sub-Saharan Africa in the last 10, 12 years, is that we have very high growth, which is a very good thing, as you mentioned, but then poverty remains stubbornly high in many countries. And in fact, if you look at the data from the World Bank, you will see that the number of people living on less than $1.25 a day has actually doubled in the last 30 years. So there are more and more people now born in Africa, born in poverty, than there were 30 years ago. And I think this is a paradox because this shouldn't happen if you have very high growth rates, as we've seen in China, India now, and so on. So that's one thing I want to keep in mind. The second thing is that, since we are in a post-2015 environment already, we're going to finalize what the goals look like in a few months. We know now historically, when we look at the data, that many of the fragile and conflict-affected states will not meet any of the MDGs, and many of these countries, sadly, are in sub-Saharan Africa. So that's the other thing we need to keep in mind. Many of these countries are still aid-dependent. They mobilize a lot of resources, actually, and that may be surprising to some. In fact, fragile states are mobilizing more than 5 times the amount of aid. So they are doing a lot of effort, but it's clearly not enough. And I go back 12 years, 13 years ago, when you look at the Monterey Consensus, which was the first conference on financing for development, domestic resource mobilization was actually mentioned as one of the leading actions out of this consensus. And there were many others, trade, debt, systemic issues, and so on, but DRM, domestic resource mobilization, is a key aspect of this consensus. And as Moses mentioned, in a few months, in July, we're going to have a third Financing for Development conference in Addis Ababa to discuss, again, financing issues, which are really important, given that we're going to agree on sustainable development goals a few months later. So, the money has to be there. And I think the discussion about who pays for what and how much is needed really needs to be brought into the discussion. I personally am not very optimistic about this third Financing for Development conference, because I think it's just going to be one of those general declarations with not much content in terms of actual actions, but we'll see. Maybe I'm being too too pessimistic. So we'll see in a few months whether they can actually deliver something that can be useful. DRM, as I said, is fairly broad. It's not only taxation, it's about strengthening the domestic financial sector, it's about financial inclusion, there's many other things, but in this presentation I will focus mostly on taxes and revenue mobilization. And I think in fairness there's been a lot that's been accomplished in the last few years. So for example, there's something called the African Tax Administration Forum, and you can go on their website now, you will see that it's a platform that actually, it essentially provides a platform for countries to improve the performance of tax administration. They have to report what they are doing, you can get the data. There's lots of data now on taxation. African Economic Outlook now has a database, other people have it, it's been funded by donors. The African Development Bank has been involved in the process as well. So there's a lot more information now about taxation than we used to in the African context. So it's good in a way because people can now see how taxes are being raised. And towards the end of the presentation, I will talk about something, and if I don't have time, but I think we need to look at that issue as well, because it's not just a question of raising taxes, it's also about what you do with it. And I think looking at the expenditure side and the kinds of development goods that countries are providing in return would actually, in my mind, be something we need to look at as well. So there's been a lot of developments, and now, given that we're in that post-2015 mindset already, DRM is also gaining a lot of prominence in these discussions. So some of the documents now on the third Financing for Development Conference that you can see are actually referring to domestic resource mobilization as domestic public finance. So they've changed the language slightly, but I think the bottom line is, countries need to be able to raise more revenue domestically because they can no longer depend on foreign capital or foreign aid. And there's good data now. We see that, in fact, in the last few years, developing countries have actually made a lot of effort to raise revenue. Some of them have been able to increase it up to 5%, but there are many challenges. We know that even with the revenues that have been raised, in some cases it's not enough. There's a lot of tax competition across and within countries that can be very harmful. There's lack of transparency, lack of participation in budgeting processes, and so on. So there's a lot of things, I think, that need to be improved. The other interesting phenomenon that is happening now is that in much of the discussions that we're seeing, ODA's importance is declining, relatively speaking. So while in Monterey 13 years ago, much of the emphasis was actually on donors providing aid, there seems to be a consensus now evolving slowly that donors are not going to be as involved. There's more and more emphasis on private capital, on other sources of financing, which is a bit strange because absolute amounts of ODA have increased if you look at the data. But in a relative sense, I think most people would argue that this Financing for Development Conference is not putting as much emphasis on ODA as the previous ones. And that, in a way, can have very important consequences for African countries that are still heavily reliant on aid, right? Now, why should we focus on DRM? There's several factors. The first obvious one is about aid itself. I think, historically, when we look at the commitments that were made, the pledges and the promises, donors have generally fallen short. So you cannot really rely on these commitments anymore if you're an African country. Most countries do not live up to the 0.7% target. Very few countries reach it. I think the UK proudly announced that they met it last year. Now they've actually entrenched it in law, in the British system, but most countries, except for maybe 4 or 5, do not meet this target. If you look at the Gleneagles commitments, 2005, they have not been met. Canada actually met this commitment, if you look at the numbers, but most, as a group, the donor countries did not. And again, as I mentioned, I think if you look past the numbers, there's a sense that donor views on the objectives of aid are always changing. There's a lot of skepticism about the results that have been achieved as a result of aid, so aid is becoming less and less important. The other reason why I think we should focus on domestic resource mobilization is because we have enough evidence now, looking at some of the studies, including the famous Commission on Growth and Development, that you cannot have high growth if you do not mobilize savings and invest domestically. And I think that's very clear. The Commission looked at a number of very high growth economies historically, and many of the Asian countries are there, and the typical path that you see is that these countries were actually mobilizing a lot of resources domestically, but were then invested in order to create growth. I think we know again from the data that if you rely too much on foreign capital, that these can be very volatile, so you can't depend on them. And the point that I will make again, and I talked about this earlier, is that taxation is fundamental to state building. So you can go to the old literature by Herbst and Tilley and look at the fiscal pact between the state and citizens, and I think taxation is really important because it helps build that social contract. And this is one point that I will come back to in the end. We also know from the data and from the evidence that when you rely too much on other resources rather than broad-based taxation, that it can actually be a disincentive to build institutions. So for example, and I put this here as an example, many countries that are aid-dependent historically have tended to respond to the donor objectives as opposed to crafting their own agenda, which is their domestic priorities. So when these things differ, then you have a situation where countries that are heavily dependent on aid, that are responding more and more to the donor requirement than their domestic priority. And the final point that I will make in this debate about DRM is that we know that external resources will not be enough. There's a lot of costing exercises that have been done, and the numbers range. If you think about the broad agenda of the SDGs now, it's going to cost billions of dollars. Some estimates that include climate financing go even in the trillions of dollars. So there's no way that donors will be able to support this on their own. So a lot of the financing has to come from within. Aid is clearly not going to be enough to meet an ambitious post-2015 agenda. So domestic taxes are going to play a more important role in there. If you look at the 17 SDGs and 169 targets that now are likely to be part of this new framework, Goal 17 actually talks about domestic resource mobilization. I would argue in this case that, again, there's no specific target, and I think this is something that has to be discussed. If you look at the document right now, it doesn't say in any part of that document how countries will be supported in achieving that objective. All it says is that they have to strengthen domestic resource mobilization. I've talked about the role of aid being downplayed already, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this. I think there's a consensus that private capital has to be more important. Even the high-level panel report that was co-chaired by David Cameron and the presidents of Indonesia and Liberia came to that conclusion a couple of years ago, that most of the money has to come from domestic sources. And I think they're putting a lot of weight on the fact that low and middle income countries have been able to increase revenues in the last few years. So there is that consensus that is slowly emerging, which is very different from 12, 13 years ago, whereby now more and more of the emphasis is going towards private capital and domestic resources as opposed to aid flows. As I've said earlier, I think the FFD conference can be a great opportunity, but one thing I would be very cautious about is the third point on this slide, which is that if you start de-emphasizing aid, for low-income countries in Africa, it can be financially a big burden, right? Because not all of them have the capacity to raise domestic revenue. Most of the discussion that we've seen now has focused a lot on tax evasion, illicit capital flows, but I would argue that, on the other hand, there has not been actually a lot of discussion on the domestic issue, which is really what I think we should be doing. And then, of course, if you start costing out all the development and environmental changes that you wish to see, and you start calculating how much that's going to cost, it's a huge financing gap that you need to meet. So as these get extremely big, stakeholders may get completely alienated, and the discussion, I think, will be unrealistic and unproductive. So my guess is that when we get to the FFD agenda in Addis in a few months, they will probably not even want to touch the costing, because once you start calculating how much it is, then you will realize that it's quickly getting out of control. The final point I will make on this issue is that, there's also a presumption in the literature that it's only the lack of financing that is the binding constraint. But I don't think we spend enough time on the efficiency and effectiveness of public expenditure. And this is something that I will come back to in the end, because you can tax and you can be very good at it, but you have to return something. And I think there's a lot to be said about what African countries are doing or not doing in terms of providing health, education, and the basic things such as roads and so on that we've talked about that people need. So you can tax, but you need to provide something in return to people. And that's how you build that relationship between citizens and governments. So let's see now, given that I'm so interested, but I think this is important, let's look at some of the trends in DRM, especially as they relate to Africa. So what I do in this work is I restrict the analysis to tax and non-tax revenues, and I use two sources of data to look at the numbers. Surprisingly, if you look at the data, tax collection in Africa has actually been rising. So in 2009, for the first time, it crossed the 20% of regional GDP mark. There's a paper that argues that if you want to meet the MDGs in the African context, and it's a UN document, you need to reach about 17% of GDP. But if you look at the regional average in Africa right now, it's about 20%. In 2009 it crossed, and then it's been moving up and down around that 20% mark. But that average is very misleading because it contains a lot of resource-rich countries that are driving the numbers. And if you drill down and you look at it on a country-by-country basis, you will see that in half of African countries that number is less than 17%. Now, you can do this in many ways. So this one is across regions. So you have Western Europe, Latin America and the Caribbean, East Asia, Central Europe, you have Sub-Saharan Africa, Middle East and North Africa, and then South Asia. What you will see, and I think this needs to be emphasized, is that contrary to what many people may believe, Sub-Saharan Africa does not have the lowest tax GDP ratio. In fact, it's the second lowest. So South Asia actually does worse on this count. And in the African context, it's actually far higher if you look at the numbers. And Sub-Saharan Africa also has a higher tax GDP ratio than if you average it out over low-income countries. So region-wise, Sub-Saharan Africa is actually second from the bottom, but it's not the worst in this case. There's also another interesting pattern, and I think this may sound obvious, but what this is telling you on this second picture is that the higher you grow and the higher is your income, the more taxes you're going to get. This is sort of common sense, right? And you see it across the world. So growth really matters in this case, because if you're able to grow, technically controlling for characteristics of your economy, you should be able to collect more in taxes. And you see this again across the board. Low income collect less in taxes. As you move up the income scale, you're collecting more. So of course here, in Western countries, OECD countries, we're used to paying a lot of taxes, and we don't complain that much, actually, because we're getting something in return, I assume. So that's something that is also important to keep in mind. This is the average, this is what the picture looks like for Sub-Saharan Africa. The average is the horizontal line, and you will see on this chart that there's a significant number of countries that are actually above the average. And these are usually your resource rich countries. So you have countries such as South Africa, Swaziland, Lesotho is there, I believe. So they are collecting more than the average for the region. So individual countries, you see a lot of variation across. And the question, I guess, that one would need to ask is how do we what's driving these numbers? If you look historically, you will see that, in fact, from 1996 to about 2002, there was not a lot of movement in the data. It's only fairly recently that we've started seeing a fairly big increase in taxation, and I think, and this is an interesting lesson for us, is that policy actually worked in some cases, because we've had things like introduction of VAT in many countries, establishment of revenue authorities that have led to higher revenue mobilization. Most of it, however, has been driven by the natural resource sector. If you look at the tax mix, so how the taxation, the total taxation is divided into direct, indirect, and resource taxes, you will see that almost half in the African context is actually coming from resource revenues. So there's in fact a divide between resource-rich and less resource-rich countries in the African context. So if you're resource-rich, you're collecting a lot. But that, in a way, has negative impacts, and I will talk about this in a couple of minutes. Across the board, you see an increase in taxation. The only thing that is actually declining over time is trade taxes, because many African countries have liberalized trade, and the liberalization is continuing, so the balance of taxes from trade to other things is shifting. So there's fewer tax revenue being collected in the form of taxation, in the form of trade taxes, more in resource tax, and then direct and indirect taxes. As I mentioned earlier, tax revenue is already much, much bigger than the size of aid. And this is interesting because even in one of the poorest regions in the world, most of the revenue that is mobilized is actually local and not from outside. Even though the perception by a lot of people may be that Africa is getting far more aid than what it collects domestically, it's actually the other way around. Right? A lot of money is raised domestically, but what I would argue is that in many cases that's not even enough. So you have a successful mobilizers that rely on natural resources, and then the ones that are not successful. This just shows you how the tax system is very inefficient in Africa. I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but it's just telling you that the cost of collecting taxes relative to how much you actually bring in is extremely high. So, and if you look at Africa compared to Latin America, even though they have the same tax staff ratio, Latin America is more than twice as efficient in terms of collecting taxes. So in terms of raising revenue better, I think there's a lot of room there to fund programs that can help administer taxes better. The other issue that we also discover in the research that we've done is that there's too many tax exemptions in the African context. And that represents a significant loss of revenue. So I give examples in Burundi and in Ethiopia where there's too much in terms of exemptions. The final thing that I do in this paper, this is coming from a paper that I just finished, is essentially calculate what I call a tax effort index. So instead of using the tax to GDP ratio, which is easy to find, but at the same time can be misleading. So what I mean by this is that a country can have a very high tax to GDP ratio, but it can be extremely punitive on people. Or it can raise taxes simply because of unforeseen circumstances. So for example, when there's a war, the country may go and grab whatever it can find. And there have been cases like this in the past. So you can, and then you have other places, I think Lesotho and Swaziland have this arrangement with South Africa, for example, when it comes to taxation. So they have very high taxation rates, but these do not actually say anything about the efficiency of the tax system. It's just because they have this unique arrangement with another country. So what I do in this paper is actually calculate a tax effort index, which is essentially looking at how much countries actually collect relative to the taxable capacity. So what should they be collecting given their characteristics, and how much do they actually collect? And then I take a ratio, and if it's greater than 1, the country is actually a very high tax effort country. I'll skip the regressions and all the stats because that's not important. And I'll end on this, which is essentially showing something interesting. What you get when you do this analysis, you find out actually that almost half of the African countries are actually making a lot of effort. So they are trying very hard. They are taxing as much as they can given their characteristics, and the more effort they make, the higher they can get. But what is also a problem in this picture is that there are countries actually that are off the normal trend. So there are countries that are not making a lot of effort and they don't bring enough, and then you have countries that are also trying extremely hard but they can't bring in money. And the final point I would make on this is that what it does tell us is that the structural characteristics of many African countries prevent them from collecting taxes. And one of the biggest issues in the African context is the fact that agriculture is a huge part of their economy, so they cannot actually tax agriculture, which is largely informal. So that, I think, is a problem, and I will jump to the conclusion and give you some of my takeaways from this. I think ultimately when we look at this picture, as much as I've talked about the numbers, we cannot simply think of tax issues as being reduced to goals and targets. I think we need to think broader, because we need to think about how to build better fiscal pacts between governments and citizens. So donor countries, I think, should think more broadly about the ability of countries to tax, but also in terms of how much we can make them work more efficiently, not only in terms of taxation, but in terms of providing services in return. So service delivery is actually very important in that context. And one final point that I would make, in terms of what donors can do, I would say that if you look at the data, contributions of donors to build tax capacity in Africa and elsewhere are very low. In fact, it's something like 1 or 2%, I think, of aid that actually goes directly to helping build tax capacity. So I think there could be a lot more effort made by donor countries to help countries build better tax systems. So I'm going to stop here because I know I'm out of time already, and so I'll take questions whenever.
We'll come back to that.
Yeah.
Thanks very much, Professor Samy. I think now you appreciate the finance portfolio in your countries, for those of you who are here representing countries. I hope you are able to stay with him. It sounded like Economics 100, but we need that. We need that kind of grounding, because anything else we're going to be talking about for the rest of the day is going to be anything but macroeconomics, and that's good. But we cannot underestimate the importance of being able to pay for what we want to be in the future. Just one other statistic that came out of the recent summit in Addis, that illegal financial flows out of Africa total $60 billion a year. Now, if you factor that into what my colleague here was talking about in terms of domestic resource mobilization, you begin to get the picture. The other things I would like to say, but I don't have time, so I want to call upon the next speaker, Madame Louise Ouimet, who is the chair of the Africa Study Group, and she's going to be talking about governance and leadership. She has a lot of experience in the Canadian government, including being advisor to the former Prime Minister of Canada, and she's been involved in international development and international affairs. So she brings a lot to this discussion. Yes, Madame.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me to come today, and especially to talk about this topic of governance and leadership, which I think is very central to Africa 2063 vision and central to development. Just a word on what Africa Study Group is. So it was created in 2007 by Bob Fowler, and its purpose is to raise awareness in Canada about Africa, the way Africa is moving ahead, and also to influence policies. So this year, actually, we're being an electoral year, we are pretty active, I would say. Now, I would like also to, oops, okay, it's not moving. Oh, there I go. So this is about us. So that's all. So you can take note of our website, and also we have a Twitter account. And if some of you want to become a member, just contact us. Okay. Now, before I go, well, I should stay there. Before I move into, actually, I want to do a very personal introduction, and the tone was set already earlier this morning for personal introductions, so, so that is good. I want to be provocative with my presentation, so, but before being provocative, especially with all the senior diplomats that we have here today, I want to tell you where I come from. As was said, I spent the focus of most of my career was Africa in many capacities, and I lived 10 years in Africa. To say that Africa is really dear to me. And also, I believe strongly that Africa's history has been plagued by predation in French, predation of its human and natural resources through slavery, through colonialism, through how the natural resources are being exploited today by foreign industries and Canadian ones as well, and by unfair international trade regimes. So I think it's about time. That's why I appreciate having this Africa 2063. It's time that we change all of that. It's time for bold transformation. And that's why I want to be provocative, because I believe in Africa's future and I believe in its transformation. I also strongly believe that if we collaborate, we can create a better future for everybody, instead of competing once against another to get access to these resources. So now that I've said that, I hope that you will not judge me too harshly with what I will have to say.
Sure.
Okay. So the content of my presentation, I will speak briefly about the governance in how it is pictured in Africa 2063. Looking backwards a bit, especially since 2000, so the last roughly 15 years since the NEPAD was put in place, and as was said, I was actually working in the Prime Minister's office looking at the NEPAD, or the previous document that was in January 2001, and saying, yeah, this really makes sense, and this is really an African-owned document and vision and so on, and so we have to support this, which Canada did. And also then, looking ahead in terms of how can we achieve this vision? I think this is what we are here to talk about today. From an African perspective, although I'm not African, what can Africa do about it? But also, what can the international community in Canada do about it? So. Okay, now, actually I have two slides that are very, that I don't want to read, but the first slide is really the seven inspirational, aspirational goals of Africa 2063, as you see it in the document. So I have put, I wanted to highlight that actually governance was very central there, because it touches the goal number 3 and 4. Good governance, democracy, rule of law, human rights is there, as well as peaceful and secure. I think governance touches also about security and in Africa. And it's also very key in the critical enablers factors for transformation. So as we see it, the second one, accountability, leadership, and responsive institutions, as well as capable and democratic developmental states and institutions. So all I want to say is that in Africa 2063, good governance and leadership is central. It's absolutely central, and we could argue that it is also part of the others, but I don't want to grab everything. So, what can governance deliver? Well, I thought that doesn't come from 2063, but from a presentation that was made very recently at an African Union meeting by Ted Ellers, and who was actually one of the authors of Africa 2050. Actually, you're saying it is very ambitious for 2063, but if you have this book of Africa 2050, realizing the continent's potential, I mean, their time frame is actually shorter than that. And so, Africa will need to have institutions capable of delivering on a sustained basis individual and property rights security to all citizens, ensuring that successful people are able to reap the fruits of their efforts rather than have them appropriated by a politically well-connected group. Access to quality education, health and infrastructure services, and a business environment that fosters competition and supports innovation. So, also, some of the characteristics of a well-functioning state capable of delivering public goods. This time I won't read it all. You can do that. I think we see all of those elements in the Africa 2063 vision, one way or another. And I've highlighted one that I've added myself from my experience. We need better, clearer boundaries and responsibilities between elected and executive officials. I mean, I've seen too many times, and in DRC, that was one particular case back in 2010, where the departments were completely managed and led by the political appointees and the ministers, and thus not having any sort of public administration that can continue to deliver its services on a more professional and continuous basis, because with each minister change, you saw, the change of staff and no continuity at all. So I think that's one element that is very, very important. Now, looking backwards, I mean, very quickly, I mean, we can go into a lot of details, but I've simply looked at a few, we have all these indexes that you can all see them, so let's not reinvent them. But I looked at the most recent Mo Ibrahim index, and he has been able to find a leader this year, thank God, to get the prize. But looking back since the index started back in 2001, the overall improvement was from 47.6 to 51.7. So that's an 8% improvement over some 12, 13 years. I mean, that is good, but I don't think this is sufficient to achieve the kind of transformation that Africa is looking at right now. It was said earlier, there are more democratic governments, but elections are not always free and fair. And sometimes the participation level from citizens is too low to have that kind of legitimacy that we want to have. Mind you, we have this problem here too, where participation in elections is actually declining. That was mentioned, the outflow of illicit finance has increased by 35% and now 60 billion, as was just said. On the positive side too, I mean, doing business, the latest report shows that Sub-Saharan Africa made more regulatory improvements than any other region in the world. So that is very, very good. There are also fewer conflicts today than there were in 2000, but the kind of insecurity that we're facing today is complex, and it is still, this is still a major problem. And I was very glad to see that Africa 2063 has the goal of making all the guns silent a few years from now, 2020, that's 5 years from now. Wow. If that could be achieved, that would be absolutely tremendous. NPSIA, the Africa peer review mechanism, which I've always strongly believed in, I think today the output from that is so-so, I mean, only 34 out of 54 countries have gone through the whole mechanism. A few countries now are into their second review. I didn't find on the net, because now I'm left with the internet to find my sources on many occasions. I I don't find that the APRM really has held to its promises. So I'm not sure it is the instrument that helps really improving significantly governance in Africa, and it's supposed also to help sharing lessons learned and so on. There are meetings every year to share the lessons, but so far I think it has to, the African Union will have to decide what they want to do with this APRM. And the last one, looking backwards, it's freedom in the world, which I think is very important as we want to unleash citizens, the power of citizens and the capacity of citizens to create, to innovate, and to hold their government to account. So, I mean, that's probably not very much readable, but you can see the colors where there are a lot of blue in Africa, which means not enough, less than 50% freedom. Actually, the overall average for Africa is 12%. But in Russia, it's close to 0% actually. So there are worse regions in the world. And here, Americas, we're not 100%, we're roughly 80%. So, what to do? Where to start? That is the part that I found the most difficult, because so much has to do. Where is the leadership? I mean, there's a clear need for leadership to move forward with this transformative agenda. I think it has to be at all levels. It has to start from individual level to local, a department, a province, a country, a region, and the entire continent. This is what I read through Africa 2063 that you want to achieve. It needs, I think, to have very clear principles and strategies and action plans to be put in place, and very quickly. I had a look at the Africa Governance Platform to see what I could find there in terms of principles and strategies, but I must say that in terms of principles and the values it wants to put forward, there was a list a list of treaties and instruments that Africa has adhered to. But I think it has to go one step beyond, one step further, and actually very clearly take those principles and values, and they are throughout the Africa 2063, but they have to be stated very clearly, and stated to the face of Africans. I was just going to say the face of the world, but to the face of all Africans first. I think that all Africans have to know, have to believe in the Africa 2063. So credibility has to be enhanced, I would say, and also there are accountability gaps that need to be addressed. I didn't mention it, but out of the Mo Ibrahim Index, accountability was the one area where there has actually been a decline in the last few years. So it calls for dialogue and action. It calls also for bold and quick actions while you're developing your long-term vision that will be supported with sustainable and long-term transformation actions. So I decided to mention a few what I call bold actions. You may not like them, but I want to generate some discussion, so there they are. First one, the rules of the game have to be changed. I think that it would be better to have at the head of the African Union the leadership that really will call on the transformation. So I think the selection of the turning president of the African Union should be based on the quality of leadership of that person in their own country, and instead and I would put aside the regional representation as a bold action. Regional integration, very important as well. So it's time maybe to rationalize all these regional economic commissions that exist. I know West Africa a little bit more, so I've spoken this. I've chosen this area to illustrate. You know, you have UMOA, you have ECOWAS, you have different currencies. You still have the franc CFA tied to the euro and France. Why? And I know that this has been in the talks for many years. Well, just do it. I mean, can you try to do it in a very, very short term? You know, have a single currency, have integrated markets, and unfold the UMOI into ECOWAS, so there is only one regional commission for the regional integration in West Africa. That's an example. Selection of public servants. It should be merit-based all the time. We should have, you know, African countries need to have very professional public servants. And actually, you can attract, it is very possible to attract very capable Africans that are living in Africa, that are living outside in the world. And I have my one experience that I had was that in 2010, when I was providing support to the Prime Minister's office of DRC, he brought in a lot of very qualified people, Congolese, that were working and living in different countries in the world, US, Belgium, France, all over the place. But the system didn't change. The way they were working did not change. So these people were actually completely useless, and they were the most, I would say, the most frustrated people, because they could not, you know, bring back to their country what they have learned everywhere else. So this is one area. Also, citizen engagement. That has improved. I mean, we see the young people a lot more active throughout Africa, but launch platforms to engage citizens and civil society organizations to ensure that the public goods are well delivered. Improve a lot on social accountability. I mean, that's an area where it can, and that can be done at the local level. Another couple of democracy. I didn't talk much about democracy, but here's a few things that you could argue with. But I think the way political parties, if there's 200 political parties in a country at the moment, in any country, I don't think that the democracy can work very well. So why not put a limit on the number of political parties? And ban political parties that would be based on regionalism or religion, or find another way. The other one is pretty. I personally do not believe that we need to actually limit the number of terms in office that the president can have, because if the elections are free and fair, normally they will end up having some kind of alternates, you know, and it will change. But perhaps, you know, there is a limit to being a head of state for too many years. I said 15 there, but it can be 20. I mean, but I think there is a need for a certain limit. And when you find that the elections are not free and fair, please declare it. But we've seen the other way around too. You know, when opposition parties are not happy with the results and they declare the election is not free and fair. So that is a problem in both ways. And Samy, I mean, Professor Samy mentioned about that, you know, in terms of public finance management, report cards better explain the budget to the people so that they can exercise some kind of oversight to it. And I would say publish court decisions to improve on the rule of law. Okay, maybe I don't know where I am with time. 5 minutes? Oh.
No.
Hey? 2 minutes? Okay. Pragmatic leadership. I will. You can read that. I will. Okay. Now let's turn to the international community. I think we have to be bold also. And when elections, same advice. When elections are not free and fair, we should dare to say so. We don't always. We need to change the rule of the games for fair and have better and fairer trade, international trade, investment rules, prosecute offenders, even in our country. Really, it's a change of rule of games on our side. We also have to provide financial and technical support to African-led peacekeeping missions and provide support also to the AU, and we already do to a certain degree, as we just said, but anyways, and also to the regional economic commissions. We have to increase the transparency of our own banking systems in order to make it more difficult for the flight of, to help repatriation of illicit funds and make it more difficult to do so, to actually export African funds, and make ODA, we need to increase it because it has really declined, but also make it more predictable, more transparent, and use the country system much better. Now I have a few slides about what Canada should do differently. Those slides are used by our group in different fora. I think Canada has to have a clearer and a new foreign policy and engage with its citizens. We need to engage on an equal basis with Africa, and we need to have partnerships at multi-levels with African countries, between civil societies, between universities, and so on and so on. And there's no one-size-fits-all. African countries are very different, so we need to have an approach that would be very different. We also need to introduce mandatory compliance to international CSR standards and have prosecution in Canada. And we have to redefine effectiveness in the long run instead of short-term delivery of public goods, which is what we have now. It's not bad, but we can do better. And we have a policy of focus countries, so a very limited number of African countries have access to bilateral programs. I'm not saying that's bad, but I think now it's time to evaluate it and see if it has produced the benefit that we want to see. And I think better leverage African diaspora, the way they benefit back to their own countries. Give public servants the capacity to implement development programs, more decentralization and more and reinvest in the diplomacies, because the presence of Canadians in the field it works two ways. It helps us better understand what is going on in Africa, so in that term, better find solutions to the real problems. And then also, it will help increasing Canada's influence in the world. Thank you. That's it.
Thank you very much, Louise. I think now we begin to see moving from the general to the specific, with Louise really talking about how do we implement this vision. Implementation is extremely important, because if you can't implement it, you could as well not talk about it. Let me give you a few thoughts here. You cannot implement what you don't know. Last summer, I was at a conference in Port Elizabeth, Nelson Mandela Metropolitan University. I got this, so I'm very proud of it. And I was talking about this very issue of AU Agenda 2063. And there was a room full of people, both from Africa and elsewhere. And the first question I asked was, put up your hand if you have heard about AU Agenda 2063. And 10% of the audience has heard about it. 90% had not heard about it. Flip it back to your own countries. If I walked on the streets of Accra, Maseru, Joburg, Kampala, Lagos, and I took a sample of your citizens and asked them the same question, what percentage of your citizens would say they've heard of AU Agenda 2063? Any taker?
Zero.
Zero.
What percentage would say that they have heard of the AU? That's the question.
I'm not going to go there. And I want to introduce the next speaker. Ms. Patricia Malikail, who is the Director General Pan-African Bureau of the Department of Foreign Affairs, Trade and Development, Canada. She's going to be talking about the vision and partnership. Madam.
Thank you very much, Moses. I think I'll just stay here because I don't have a PowerPoint presentation. I wanted to talk a little bit about how, as a practitioner, you respond to something like Agenda 2063. You know, here's a vision that's supposed to be 50 years out, came after, as Dr. Gariba reminded us, 50 years after one of the first nations became independent in Africa. So what does a country like Canada do when you see that? And I think we just reorganized our Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. We merged with our former development agency about a year ago. And through that merger, we were able to create what I represent, which is the Pan-Africa Bureau. And it was a bureau that was intended to actually be able to engage with Africa at the continental level and at the level of regional economic communities. And I think that's important, and I think we were reminded by the fact that it's important to have a vision and it's important to have aspirations, because then people will know where they're heading. You know, where are we going to head, even if it's a goal? It's important also because that's what you can start to unpack. You know, how do you unpack all these things? Who's going to do the transformation? When are they going to do the transformation? What kind of pieces are they going to be able to chew up and work on? And I think that it was very interesting, and I was quite privileged to be at the African Union Commission about 2 weeks ago, meeting with the commissioners and talking about Agenda 2063 and how they saw their work over the next little while. And I wanted to talk a little bit about what I observed and the progress that I sensed. I think, first of all, when we were reminded about the fact that Agenda 2063 gives us a vision, but it's also an opportunity to engage in some critical thought about what worked and what didn't work. You know, I think what you could say has worked is the fact that you look at a vision on a continental basis. If Africa is going to be able to leapfrog, for example, on some of the infrastructure challenges that it's facing, it's through collaboration, it's through leadership, and it's through champions, like presidential champions, who drive something through, just like Mateo Sepa helped drive through today's forum. But we need those champions, and we need that collaboration on a continental basis. None of these challenges can really be tackled, we know, on a national basis. Okay. I think that what I was also able to observe was how the African Union itself is harnessing leadership. And perhaps that's most evident when you look at democracy, and you look at good governance and elections, and when you look at peace and security. It was very interesting to me to hear how the AU Panel of the Wise and the Africa Forum, which groups many former presidents, is being deployed. You know, you see General Obasanjo being deployed, you see Mr. Chisano being deployed, you see Ejem Koja being deployed, Nigeria, DRC, South Sudan, all of these places where you see a peer pressure being exerted by leaders who are ready to show leadership even though they're no longer in office. And that's extremely important, because I think that kind of peer pressure, as I've seen working on the G8, is very effective. That personal diplomacy, that personal peer pressure, that sense of, you know, are you going to be able to stand up and look like you're a leader in this continent is extremely important. So it was very interesting to see that they were deploying these leaders and that was working. I think that, you know, we're looking at fundamentally leadership in support of sound, accountable, and transparent government. That's one of the chunks that we're looking at. And Louise talked about NEPAD and the Africa Peer Review Mechanism, and she was very skeptical, and I was skeptical too, seeing, are these things alive? Is it really working?
So much.
Yeah. And I think it's great that we actually still have strong leaders of NPAD. So we have Macky Sall now, the president of Senegal, believing in NPAD, working on NPAD, working to see that through. It was interesting to me at the African Union, I was saying, well, the African peer review mechanism, is it really on your radar screen? Is anything really happening? And they in fact said, well, actually, yes, that is still very important to us. Maybe not all the countries have signed on, but we're working right now on is the step that actually makes or encourages countries to link their national programs of action with their national budgets. It's a little bit back to what Professor Samy was saying. That's a very practical approach. So what people are saying is you set your peer review mechanism. This is your country's vision. This is what you want to achieve. Now you have to make sure that the finance are there to achieve it. So that is a really important step, and a step that I'm glad that people have their eyes on and are ready to do it. Maybe I'll take one step back and say it was also very impressive to me that the African Union is asking itself the question, has anybody heard of us? They're actually taking surveys and they're not finding very good results. And I think that is what has led the Social Affairs Department and Madame Zuma to actually try and engage social media in a big way. To be able to answer questions directly from the population. I think she did something like a 2-hour engagement, and I think 40 million people took part in that on social media. So just the fact that some people are asking themselves that question and seeing, okay, what do we do to overcome these challenges is a really good sign, and a sign of real leadership. When we look at partnership and how do you then unpack the Africa 2063 vision, and we can't do all of it today, but I want to maybe choose a few areas where we think we can do it, because we ourselves have done thinking not only on our development priorities, but also our priorities in the large 35,000 foot level for Africa. We want to support mutual economic prosperity, championing democracy, governance, and human rights, consolidating peace and security, investing in human potential. They may sound like buzzwords, they may sound like cliches, but we have to articulate what we're trying to do. I think that when you unpack that, which is what we've been doing, is we've been saying, okay, well, who are the actors that are really multipliers, and who are the actors that will give us synergies, make this transformational work more efficient, more effective, perhaps give us more impact. And absolutely, those two areas are women and youth. And that's something where we in Canada, and I think the African Union, are right on the same page on. Working with women and youth. So what are you going to work with women and youth on? We're seeing that leadership in terms of sound, accountable, and transparent government. So how do you make that connect with transparency, with the other actors that are working in this area? I think it's pretty interesting to see that the African Union is very conscious of the fact, and this goes back again to what Dr. Samy was saying, is that it's not governments alone that are gonna make this transformation happen. You have to involve the private sector, and you have to involve civil society. So the annual high-level dialogue this year is going to be looking at women and women's role in decision-making and political processes, and that will carry it on to next year when you look at the Year of Human Rights, especially looking at women. I think it's looking at, where are the docking points between what is happening on policy making and the private sector. And you see things happening like the African Minerals Development Center, which is something that Canada has been a founding supporter of, looking at how do they connect with chambers of mines. So the two big initiatives they were talking about was connecting with private sector chambers of mines and also looking at women in mining. If you look at the informal sector, if you look at agriculture, and if you also look at artisanal mining and women, these are areas where if you actually focus on women as actors in making these transformations, you could have a huge impact. So women in the informal sector, youth in the informal sector are going to be very important. So what are the ways that Canada connects all these together? You have to bring the leaders together. And where do you do things like that? I've started attending mining shows. It's not something that I necessarily thought I would be doing as the DG of Pan Africa, but I'm attending mining shows not to talk about Canadian mining companies, but to talk about Government of Canada policy on mining. So we're able to talk about not only policies that the Government of Canada has taken, including a newly announced enhanced CSR strategy last November, which is actually making it mandatory for Canadian companies in the extractives area working abroad or working in Canada, mandatory reporting of all payments that they make to government officials, to public officials, at different levels of government. So it's not only national governments, but it's subnational governments. That is in place now. It's something that actually some of our larger companies we're quite aware of and have been working on for many years. But I think as more African countries are realizing, and as we too are realizing in Canada, those who are driving growth right now, those who are driving exploration and even jobs are the smaller junior mining companies. So one of the things that we did last year in November was also talk about a new corporate social responsibility counselor. He was named at the Prospectors and Developers show this month, in fact, in Toronto, Jeffrey Davidson from Queen's University, and he will be doing outreach to these companies. So that's one area. I think in extractives, we're trying to bring the companies together with leaders, with ministers, with civil society, and we're working on what I've been hearing of the African Union on was also how do you actually make the extractive sector a catalyst in terms of development of other sectors. So it's not necessarily that you're adding value to your gold or you're processing it in one country, but how do you actually make that mine connect to access to energy for local communities, maybe even broader than local communities? How do you make that mine increase agricultural productivity and access to food? What can you do in those areas? So we're getting leaders in the public and private sectors in energy, agricultural resources, and natural resources management to share experiences. And we're doing things like promoting projects on mineral audits within governments. So that's one step that we're taking towards sound, accountable, transparent government. The other things that we're seeing is that these sectors and energy ministers and ministers of natural resources increasingly want to know about education. So we had ministers come to PDAC who went to meet with the colleges and the head of the colleges and institutions of Canada to talk about how do you link those two? How do you make one move the other? And that was a really encouraging experience because we've seen a lot of good work there, and actually a lot of good work done by our mining companies on skills development for employment. I got a question earlier in the break, is this really transferable? And I think it is. You know, if you learn to drive, one-ton truck, you can drive other things too. And when that mine job goes, you can do other things that you're skilled to do. So we're very happy to see some of the work that's being done to encourage women to go in this area. So let me just say, focusing on, leadership in support of sound, accountable, transparent government, increasing access to energy, increasing access to food are areas where we're looking for overlap between Agenda 2063. There are medium-term goals like how do you increase internal trade in agricultural products. Those are things that we'll be working on. So we'll continue to look at those medium-term milestones on the way to Agenda 63, working on those and moving forward together with the African Union. Thank you very much, Moses.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much, Patricia. The one takeaway for me is the vision acting as a platform for conversation, developing shared vision and moving ahead together, and that is creating partnership. We are now going to be opening the session for discussion, but there are two things I want to talk about first, very briefly. One is we've been talking about collaboration. My president talked about collaboration. There is one positive thing about what the AU Commission has done, which they never did previously, and that is working very closely with other continental agencies like the African Development Bank, like the UN Economic Commission for Africa, and NEPAD. This is a good thing, and I don't know Madam Zuma personally, but I kind of think that she is one of a kind. We should have more women in the... The other thing I want to say is, and this is directed to the excellencies, I know in Africa we don't play baseball that much, but if you know the rules of baseball, 3 strikes and you are out. If you think about what we've been doing in the last 50 years, we had the Lagos Plan of Action, we had the Abuja Treaty. Those are 2 strikes. We cannot afford Agenda 2063 as another strike. We are out. I open this for discussion, and the rule is going to be, we'll take about 3 questions. You can direct your question either to one of the speakers or in general. And then after those questions, then I'll ask the speakers to make very, very brief interventions. We've had enough from them. I want to hear more about you. We have got 1 or 2 kind of, if you want to, I think it's better if you stand behind the micro so that others can hear from you. I apologize, we do not have simultaneous translation. We just couldn't afford it. I mean, it costs too much. You know. So I'll start here. Yes, sir. Is the mic on?
I hope I didn't break it.
Speak loud, please.
I want to thank you all brilliant minds. I'm new to the African development sector. My name is Michel Morisset. I'm the promoter of a project in Africa to help small farmers grow more for their family, their neighbors, their village, their region, their country. And in 5 years from me stepping on the African continent, we will be exporting across the world. You have taught me a lot. You are minds that I wanted to talk to. Taxation, you talk about taking bold action. I am taking bold action. You are talking about women's empowerment. I'm in that too, and children's education. So I will be in touch with you. Thank you very much. Thank you for your speeches.
Next, please.
Hi, my name is Ilku Dimov.
Louder, please.
Hi, my name is Ilku Dimov. I'm working with Executive Intelligence Review. I am associated with Linda Baruch, who was a presidential candidate in the United States. My question concerning the long-term development. You know, the issue of funding, financing this project. You know, Thomas Sankara many years ago, in a famous speech in Addis Ababa, called for creation of African Development Bank, discussion on the debt of Africa. You know, the moment has arrived where this thing has to be discussed in the context of the recent proposal by the Greek government to create an European conference to discuss the debt of the European country. I think for the African Union will be a good opportunity today to come with a resolution supporting this. So we can see actually the structure of the debt. We can look what the debts are coming, how much money are actually going to Africa, how much money are actually we're looting out of Africa. So we can have the opportunity to use the African money for development of the Africans. The other opportunity which is arising in the last 8 months is the development of the BRICS, you know, Russia, China, India, South Africa. These countries are taking bold initiatives, they're creating international institutions, which are the only one which right now actually have a real proposal, a real negotiation and signing, like Nicaragua Canal, project for economic development. So I would like to propose the Asian Development Investment Bank. You know, this institution, or the BRICS development banks, are open institutions. What the African leaders think about joining this institution or creating similar institution for the development of Africa. Thank you.
Thank you. Next.
me or Justin? Okay, I guess I'll go.
Yeah.
All three of you touched on this.
Your name?
Victoria Shore. I'm with the Africa Study Group as well, Louise. All three of you touched on this vaguely, and I'd just like to hear more about it, which is the market formalization process. Most markets in Africa are informal, especially as was mentioned with women and youth. What is being done on this? This will of course help for taxation as well as governance purposes, all sorts of aspects it comes with. So I'm wondering what sort of insights you have for promoting the market formalization process.
Okay, we'll take one more. Yes, well, let's do this and then maybe the couple.
Okay, I joined the list a little late, so.
That's okay, you go ahead.
This is African system, you can go ahead.
You go ahead.
Well, I actually,
Your name?
my name is Toby Morsum, and I'm a contract instructor here at Carleton University. And my PhD work is actually on the impact of neoliberal structural adjustment policies on African farmers in southern Zambia. And I was looking particularly at a group of very prominent farmers that had been emerging capitalists in the early post-independence days. It was part of a longer development project which was established at a time of independence where the goals were being set that could not have foreseen the present. And so that was about 50 years ago, and now we're looking here to talk about what we should be expecting from the AU in 50 years from now, and we're talking here about what are described as sound macroeconomic policies. But what are considered sound macroeconomic policies today are not what they were considered 50 years ago. Yet largely the conditions of the continent are dramatically similar insofar as the challenge is still to integrate a predominantly rural peasant population and include their labor somehow towards a larger national development project. And the experiences of those farmers that I saw, all I would say is that these speeches, I think that we should actually, I encourage a level of humility towards the prospects of what might occur in the next 50 years.
Okay,
none of the panelists mentioned climate change whatsoever, and none of the panelists talked about the sustainable capacities of things like mining development. What occurred to those farmers is that their land got polluted by mineral effluents off of the tailings from mining many hundreds of kilometers away. And that could not have been foreseen. So I think we need to be have a little humility and consider sustainability, which is the first part of this panel that was not discussed.
Point taken, take these three and then ask the panelists to respond. Yes, sir.
Moses, my name is Houston Lako, University of Juba Center for Peace and Development.
Welcome.
Thank you. I'm not new to this. First, my question to Patricia. How many African diaspora in your department working to facilitate this Pan-African Bureau policy to help Africa? Number two, the same question to you, First Lady. Relation to Canada and Africa, and the role Canada can play in Africa. Unfortunately, the foreign policy of Canada is not positive. We have seen many African leaders, including the Vice President, the diplomat, visas are denied to them to enter Canada. It's not healthy. The relationship of the Canadian government with the African diaspora is not positive. So what would be your response to that? Question to Ambassador of Ghana. You have mentioned about the policies with regard to mineral, of course, the negative resources there in Africa. I think you would agree with me that there is a lack of policy to actually facilitate or to help the foreign companies to invest more in the people's life than to just take the money and extract the resources. Thank you.
What's the question to the ambassador, the High Commissioner?
The High Commissioner,
What's the question?
the question is the lack of policy to encourage the foreign investors to invest in the Africa instead of extracting the resources and take it out.
Take it.
Thank you.
Next.
You're going to have your work cut out for you for these questions. My name is Matthew Arrett, and I'm speaking on behalf of the Schiller Institute. And the question, I guess I'll try to make it short. Prime Minister Lee Kiggundu was recently in a variety of African countries where he gave a series of speeches on the idea of connecting various capitals, all capitals in Africa by high-speed rail in a massive industrial policy program that the BRICS are currently representing, and with what you have with the recent AU-China Memorandum of Understanding alongside a variety of other projects that have been proposed by the Eurasian powers towards Africa, it seems like we've been neglecting this big, very important discussion regarding this major player with the BRICS Development Bank having been created and other institutions. I was wondering what role would Canada and other Western countries who have been invited to participate, what role would we play towards this very pro-industrial policy? And I guess I'll leave it at that one.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Last.
Daniel Khazin, Africa Study Group. A simple historical correction, the first country that got its independence in Africa was Sudan, 1st of January 1956, and then
Thank you for that.
Sure, and a general comment. It is good to talk a little bit about vision, but really what we want to see is a plan of action.
Yeah.
The vision could be anything, so please bear in mind to invite us back. But one fundamental question to the whole panel: what do you see as commonalities between the different African nations and different African regions that can make us talk about Africa as an entity other than a geographic entity? What is the connection between the 6 countries in the northern part of Africa that actually have dual nationalities and those countries that are actually in the Lakes region? So we would like to see a commonality, a baseline, so that we can talk about Africa in a context other than geographic.
Thank you, sir. You want to intervene?
Une question. Je vais pas poser ma question en français.
Yeah, can you make it
I
short?
can translate.
Can you make it
C'est
short?
par rapport à vous-même. J'ai un problème de compréhension concernant le seuil de pauvreté. Vous avez dit quelque part que le seuil de pauvreté était de 1,25% par jour. $1,25 par jour. En 2000, pour 205 millions.
Non. Tout ce que je dis, I'm going to answer in French and then I'll translate myself. Okay. Donc tout ce que j'ai dit, j'ai repris les données de la Banque mondiale qui utilise le $1,25 comme le seuil de pauvreté. C'est ça.
En 1991 et en 2010, il y a un gap que je n'ai pas compris. Parce qu'on dirait qu'il y a eu une progression du nombre de pauvretés.
Non, il y a une progression dans le pourcentage.
Ah, c'est ça justement.
Mais il y a c'est-à-dire, la population a grandi, le pourcentage diminue, le pourcentage de personnes qui est pauvre est en train de diminuer, mais en valeur absolue, il y a de plus en plus de personnes qui sont pauvres.
Mais le pourcentage diminue.
Oui. So,
Can you translate yourself?
all I was saying is that the percentage of people living in absolute poverty has declined very slowly in Africa. But if you look at the absolute numbers, they've actually gone up.
Okay, we have had a number of questions: long-term development plans, market formalization, structure adjustment, African diaspora, how to add value to our resources, infrastructure, and China, what do you normally call the elephant in the room, and what is common among African countries. So, one thing here. You want?
I don't think anything was aimed at me. Well, I mean, I'll just...
Market formalization.
Yeah, but in some of the work that we've done, what we've found, and of course everything is based on the empirical analysis, I think what we find is that African countries face a very important constraint, which is the informal sector. But in the paper, I don't actually talk about it. I'm not an expert on how to change the informal to the formal sector, but I know that it's a major constraint. And one of the conclusions that we reach is that we may have to temper the expectations regarding how much more effort African countries can make. Because what is happening when you look at the numbers, and I think it goes back to your point, the resource-rich country in Africa have no incentive to tax better, because they can collect resource revenue very easy. So the incentive for them is that they do not feel the need to do that. So there is room for them to actually collect taxes better, but they just don't have the incentive. And I think donors could actually could implement or have policies or try to encourage them to tax better. Because one of the challenges that they will face, and we're starting to see this in the last few years, is that resource prices tend to be extremely volatile. And the moment you see a drop in commodity prices in the world, then revenues will become very volatile. So you cannot continue to rely on resource revenues, hoping that resource prices will keep going up. And I think that's one of the messages that I would, that's one of the lessons that we learned from doing this work.
Patricia?
Okay. So I'm going to try and deal with a whole bunch of questions at once.
That's good.
I mean, starting with the last, which are what are the common threads that we see in Africa? I mean, I think that the fact that these nations are sitting around the table at the African Union, that the leaders are sitting there, that ministers are sitting there, that civil society is sitting there, means that they see each other as common threads. And that's what counts. It's not what I think is a common thread. So I think that they see that getting together and collaborating increases their voice in matters that are global. And I think that's a pretty important reason to collaborate, and I think leaders in Africa are seeing that. So that's one. I think that if you're looking at some of these big infrastructure projects, there was a question about the high-speed rail and the position of Canada on the BRICS banks and on the China's Asian Bank. I don't think the government of Canada has taken a position on it yet. I'm sort of a micro person more than a macro person, I think, in this case. I think that actually if you look at what's worked, if you have put some resources, sometimes modest resources, into the hands of people who are the poorest, whether they're working in agriculture, whether they're working in some sort of small businesses, if you look at this, you can make huge gains. And I think that if you look at the Productive Safety Net program, for example, in Ethiopia, that's one example of where that has happened, where you increased resilience, where you increased people's ability to deal with all sorts of shocks, whether it's a health shock or whether it's a climate change shock. So I think that actually working with those who are the poorest, making sure that they have access to resources, including women, is a very important start on that. There was a question about African diaspora and how many of them are in the department. I actually don't know how many we have from the African diaspora in our department, but certainly, I mean, one of the things that our department does is talk all the time to African diaspora from a variety of countries. And I don't think I would agree with you that the department's relationship with all of the African diaspora is not positive. I think, there's probably there are probably variations there. I think I'll stop there and people can come back to me.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. I thought no question was actually towards me, but there's one question that we need to address is the humility of the panelists. I will take that one, and the fact that we haven't touched on any of the sustainability issues, and that is true because there was a limit of time, and so we could not address everything in our presentations. So definitely this is very, very important and needs to be addressed, and I think I would like to see that sustainable and creative solutions would come from the African continent. I mean, it would be probably a disaster if they would just replicate what we have done here in Canada. So yes, so that remains to be addressed and is very, very key. On the major infrastructure, how to connect the capitals, well, I think that's one of the things I wanted to mention when I said, Africa suffered because of colonialism and all of these things. The infrastructure backbone has not been created to support Africans talking and marketing between themselves. So this is a major gap that has to be addressed. There was one question also from Victoria on how to formalize the market process. I am not a specialist, but from what I saw during my career is that given that the boundaries were actually a bit artificial, you would see the same populations on both sides of the border. There was a lot of informal integration and a lot of informal market going on. Now, how to address this and make it more formalized? I know in West Africa there are plans, but it's still not very effective to actually reduce the barriers between the different countries, to reduce the number of checkpoints where people have to pay something in order to get from one country to the next country. So those are significant barriers to the more formal trade, but I'm afraid this is not a satisfactory answer. I don't know if anybody else has more knowledge than me on this.
I'm afraid we are going to be cutting this off. Or we are going to be cutting this off.
Oh, the debt issue. Well, okay, I can speak to that one.
I can only take two more
questions. There was still one question to talk about.
Louise.
There's still one question to respond to debt, and that was one I thought Samy would. Well, the debt issue, I mean, debt has been forgiven for African countries many years ago. But now I think countries are re-indebting again, but definitely not at the rate that they were before. So I don't think at the moment this is a very significant issue.
I'll let the High Commissioner for Ghana respond because he was specifically identified in one of the questions. And then, depending on how much time we have, I'll allow one or two questions and then cut. Yes, sir. I'm not sure if this, yeah.
Just a quick response to the question regarding the policies that are being made to encourage more investment. First of all, there's quite a significant effort now being made by many African countries to speak to each other about getting a common framework for both encouraging but managing foreign investment, especially in the extractive areas. And as Patricia mentioned, there are lots of platforms now that enforce certain accountability parameters. So for instance, the percentage of royalties. Countries are trying to, among African countries, harmonize those percentages so that on the one hand you don't push the limits in creating this incentive, but on the other hand, you don't undercut each other. So there are significant processes now in place. But two other quick comments. First of all, the identity of the African Union is very significant.
Yes.
Africa is not a country. Africa comprises many countries. So sometimes you get things like, oh, I have a friend in Africa. Are you going to Africa now? And so let's not forget that we're dealing with a continent that has more than 50 countries. And what makes us common, and this is a question that was raised, as Patricia mentioned, is the collective aspirations that are expressed when we sit together in a round table. The uniqueness of Agenda 2063 is that it's actually a summation of the aspirations and the manifestation of plans by individual African countries. So for example, in more than half of the 7 key pillars, they are already manifested and are being implemented in more than 20 countries. So if you go to the National Development Plan of Ghana, or of Ethiopia, or of Uganda, or of Tanzania, of Kenya, of South Africa, you will see a key pillar encouraging and working towards inclusive growth. And these are 5-year plans, 7-year plans, which are being implemented. On security, ECOWAS, SADC, and many of the regional institutions are working hard at it. So these are not just pipe dreams. They came as a result of the collective wisdom of, as Patricia said, sitting around the table. That commonality is expressed in the way in which we're working, so that there's synergy. So it is not strange to ask how many people know about Agenda 2063. You might actually draw a blank because you'll be talking to people not of the African country, but if you go into our individual countries and ask, how many people know about the National Development Plan of South Africa? Of course, you will get a lot more than if you asked about the whole continent. So I just wanted to clarify that point.
Okay. Yes, I think we are running out of time, I'm afraid. I'm told that I can't take any more questions, and I apologize for that. We started late, and this has been a very informative and useful discussion. We are going to have a lunch for 45 minutes, and keep your questions. They may come up in subsequent sessions. We can address some of these questions at lunch. These people are not going away, I hope. And so let the conversation continue, and I wish you a very good lunch, and thank you very much for your participation.